Salve. Today I decided to do an audio component to the newsletter, and I want to talk a little bit about what Latinitas is, and then give you some resources to help you with that, especially if you are writing in Latin. And one of them is a resource that was just added to Google Books and to archive.org. Alright, so first of all, what is Latinitas? I think for me in the 21st century, it has a different idea or definition than what it did to Cicero. To Cicero, there were certain Roman authors that did not have good Latinitas, and we should not, or he thought they weren't to be emulated, they weren't to be copied. A similar idea persisted for a very long time, and I'm sure people still have an opinion like that, but for us in the 21st century, for where we are, and making resources for learners of Latin, we aren't trying to emulate different styles. And again, that idea that in the Renaissance it became, okay, well, should you exclusively emulate Cicero? Are you a Ciceronian? That's not really the conversation around Latinitas anymore. So sometimes it revolves around the things that people say in speech, and sometimes, to me, the more important conversation is about the resources we create for learners. And in the 21st century, I think we are mostly concerned with not whether the Latin copies a certain style, and not whether it's grammatical per se, meaning that people generally are using cases correctly, conjugating correctly. That's not the problem. It is vocabulary usage and idiom that becomes the issue. To me, when you talk about whether or not you should address this, because some people don't even think you should talk about it, I think there's a couple different scenarios where it's either more or less useful to discuss this and or correct it. When you are having a conversation with someone in Latin or in any other language that's not that person's L1 and they're trying to learn that language, it is generally not helpful for you to correct them. It benefits them much more to hear you or other people produce that language idiomatically, and as opposed to you pointing out grammatical errors or unidiomatic speech in their language. If you start correcting people, it can make them anxious. It disrupts the flow of conversation. It can intrude on their thoughts, because a lot of times you're concentrating pretty hard when you're trying to speak Latin or another language. So it's really, to me, it's not particularly helpful to try to correct extemporaneous speech, and it's quite unnatural to do that when you're talking to somebody else. So there's another type of speech, I guess, which would be podcasts or YouTube videos, where people are creating spoken content, but it is edited. Like I will edit. I'm speaking English, which is my first language, and I will edit this. And every time I publish something in Latin, it is edited. I think the people that produce Latin resources on YouTube and this podcast generally take pretty good care. The resources are pretty good. There was a recent kerfuffle about this, and it revolved around something that I think is pretty useless, is to try to police the way or correct the way that people use Latin words to communicate 21st century ideas. So even the word for like podcast, acroama, that's the word we use for podcast. It means something pleasant to listen to. A Roman would have never understood what a podcast is if you said acroama, rete, the word for internet, rete omnium gentium, rete. That means something completely different to a Roman, but we've taken the word to mean internet. And there's tons of examples of this. So when someone uses a word for a concept that did not exist 2,000 years ago, since we don't have authoritative sources for that, we don't have a dictionary that's constantly updated. We have the Neo-Latin lexicon that was originally by David Morgan that Patrick Owens has put up on the internet. That is not constantly updated. It doesn't have more recent terms in English from the past 10 or 15 years. And I think the Vatican puts out a resource, but it's not great. And so again, there's not consensus on what words we should be usurping or using to mean modern terms. Trying to correct that, I don't know. It's just not I don't think it's a productive venture. I mean, if somebody says something completely out there, you do a double take, but the thing that was said that caused a somewhat recent incident was not completely out there. The other setting where I think that this is more important is when people produce written resources for their students to read. I think Latin is a little bit of a special case because there's this idea in comprehensible input theory, or really in second language acquisition theory, that if you hear some mistakes, that's fine. You're going to get a ton more content. Like if you're learning English, you're going to get a ton more content that's going to sort of help you form a mental model of the language, so those mistakes become irrelevant. Nobody's getting that much content in Latin. We sometimes think Latin is resource rich because we compare it to something like ancient Greek, but it's not. Realistically, it's just not. So students will also often, when they're learning, they might just use one textbook. They might use one textbook in 5 or 6 novellas. They might just be reading novellas. They might, from what I can glean online, I don't think that students in traditional classrooms are even going out, for the most part, and seeking out resources that are not given to them by their teacher. Like they're not going out and finding, some of them are, but I still see a lot of stuff on the internet where it's very clear students are just getting CLC and whatever their teacher gives them. Or so they're not getting diverse input. So they're being handed 1, 2, 3, 4. Sometimes some teachers do more than this, written resources, and they might only be hearing their teacher speak if their teacher speaks at all. So because of that, I think it's important, if these students are getting not so many resources to form this mental model of the language, that we make sure these resources teach vocabulary words as they were used in historical literature, because most students are learning Latin to read historical literature, and also that the idiom, meaning the words you use together, the locutions, the expressions, are also idiomatic and not just directly lifted from a modern language and put into Latin. And I'll give you an example of a word where the meaning in English of the cognate word has shifted a lot. And so if we just use this word in Latin to mean the English thing, then we're not going to be teaching the correct meaning of that word in Latin. So terribilis is an example of this. Terrible in English does not mean the same thing as terribilis in Latin. And again, this is just an example I could think of. If this is used in some novella or some other work, I'm sorry, this is just what I thought of. I can think of some examples I've seen, but I don't want to use them because I don't want to call anybody out. But this is just an example of this phenomenon where you've had this semantic shift into the English cognate where you can't just use the word in Latin to mean the English thing. It doesn't work. The word terrible in English and the word terribilis in Latin mean two different things. So, for example, terribilis in Latin means dirus horribilis quod terrorem injicit. What gives you terror, it brings terror to you. Terrible in English has been bleached semantically. It just kind of means bad. Like, I had a terrible day. It was awful. It wasn't good. Terribilis dies in Latin does not mean that. It doesn't mean the same thing. I have observed this in resources, especially in resources where you're only teaching maybe 20, 30, 40 unique words. Well, if you're getting the repetition of a word used weirdly a number of times, I don't think that's good. And again, sometimes students are only learning 200 or 300 words. The AP list of the core vocabulary words is only 1,000 words. So they're expecting kids to learn, or students to learn, 300 something words per year in Latin. So if we're teaching a small number of words, we don't want to reinforce with repetition the incorrect idiom or incorrect usage of these words. Another thing is I think that we should be conscious about which words we're teaching and not teach super rare words. So if you're teaching a small number of words, you want to hit those high frequency words. An example of this is I got into reading medieval cookbooks in Latin a couple years ago. And conscious of it and kind of kidding around, I started to use more medieval words that you find in cookbooks which aren't the same as classical Latin words. So brachiare, for example, means, in classical Latin would be cervisiam coquere, to brew beer, or literally in classical Latin, to cook beer. It is a lot more useful to teach a student the word coquere, cervisiam coquere, than brachiare, which I don't think you're going to see before the 12th or 13th century. And I kept saying it because I do brew beer, and I have brewed beer in the past. I was saying it to one of my friends. He's like, why are you saying, and this is a person who's very fluent in Latin. He's like, what are you saying, and why are you saying this? Another one from that time period that I kept saying is, instead of saying coquere or fervere for to cook or boil, but really when they meant cook, they kept writing bullire, which is to bubble. And it is classical, but it is not the same word as coquere. Like, coquere is way, way more common. And bullire in classical Latin literally means to bubble up. But in medieval Latin, they were just using it to mean cook. So if I were going to write a resource for my students, or students about cooking, I would not use bullire in the 14th century sense to mean coquere, because I don't want my students to learn bullire to mean coquere, and also because that's just a really rare word compared to coquere. And I'm not trying to put myself out there as an authoritative source for Latin idiom. When I write, I don't view myself as an authoritative source for Latin idiom. I spend hours in dictionaries and looking through text corpora when I'm writing to make sure that I'm using correct words together and using words correctly. And so I want to share some of those resources with you now that I spend a lot of time using, and I'll link them in the newsletter too. One of them that I think I will use a lot, but it was just in the full format, was just put up online because a Reddit user requested it from Google, Walter Ripman's A Handbook of the Latin Language, being a dictionary and a classified vocabulary and grammar. What makes this interesting to me is the classified vocabulary part. That is a semantic dictionary, and we don't have a lot of those floating around in Latin. So an example from this Ripman dictionary, I am writing a new novella. This is the first time I've said this publicly. I've just started it, but it is a prequel to the Erictho book that we put out. It's about Erictho and how she wound up the way she was. In this novella, I'm writing about religion. Well, Ripman conveniently has a semantic field for religion in his dictionary, and it gives you a whole bunch of words that have to do with religion. So it's really nice if you want to write about a topic, you can go look that topic up. And so it's super convenient. And I have not double checked, but it appears like a solid resource. In addition to this, which I plan to use, I spend a whole lot of time on the Packham Humanities Institute site looking for examples from Latin literature, that's classical literature. In this novella, Erictho, who has a different name when she's a girl, but Erictho and her family are visiting the Temple of Delphi. So I went and I was reading about how the Temple of Delphi and the Oracle to Apollo was described in classical literature, because I want to mirror that language, because it is something that is more useful to my students if I'm mirroring classical language and how they talked about things. Not syntax, because this is an intermediate level novella, but especially vocabulary. Additionally, I spend a lot of time in dictionaries. There is a somewhat new site, morcus.net, where you can use Lewis and Short, Smith and Hall, and Gaffiot, which is a good resource for quantities. It's more reliable if you're looking for vowel quantities where those macrons are than looking in Lewis and Short. They're all up on morcus.net. On the Linguax site, and again I'm going to link all these, there is Wagner's thesaurus, which is also very helpful. And just like the Ripman dictionary, Wagner provided a lot of different expressions and locutions in Latin as well. I also use Forcellini a lot. That's a Latin dictionary. A lot of Lewis and Short is based on Forcellini, but Forcellini translated into English. The Thesaurus Linguae Latinae is available online. It's not completed yet, but I think they're up through something like R, the letter R. So that can be a lot to use. I honestly spend more time in Forcellini and Lewis and Short. Okay, so I'll link those resources, and this is my general opinion on Latinitas and whether it's worthy to address it even, or when it's worthy to address it, and also the fairly informal announcement that I am writing another book And it will be about Erictho, and it will be, if you've read Erictho Tartarorum Terror or looked at examples on our webpage, it will be at about the level of Tier 1. I will update you on the progress of the novella as that gets going, and I hope everyone had a good school year and that you have a good summer. Volete!